So what we're going to be starting with is what we call monopolistic competition. And the way to think about this is that it's really in many ways closer to pure competition. So if you put pure competition over here and you put monopoly over here, okay, monopolistic competition is going to go in here. Okay, keep in mind, this is a spectrum. Okay, there's no such thing as an industry that's in perfect pure competition. There's really also no pure monopoly. Okay, even something like Microsoft has Apple, you know, so I mean, that's there's usually at least some form of competition. And then oligopoly is going to go over here. So that's kind of where we're looking today. What we're doing is kind of filling in the middle of our spectrum of industry structures. And so starting off with monopolistic competition, and if, as you'll recall, we looked at each of these industries. We're looking at a number of different characteristics. And what we have here is a relatively large number of firms, but not thousands. Okay, so we've got quite a few, but it's not like farmers. It's not like they're, you know, a dime a dozen or anything like that. There's relatively large numbers, but there's not thousands. It implies they have some control over the price. Keep in mind, pure competition, if you'll recall from 2 weeks ago, had absolutely no control over price. Monopoly had 100%. Now we've got firms that have some, okay? And there's usually enough firms in the industry that we don't have to worry about collusion, okay? There's too many people to get together, sit around a table and divide market share or what have you. It also means that when they consider their actions, they look at themselves independent, okay? What that means is like things like a return policy at a store, okay? I can do kind of whatever I want. I can say returns have to be within 30 days or 60 days or what have you. And I don't necessarily need to worry about matching what my competitor does item for item. Okay, so if they have a 30-day return policy and I want to go with a 60, or if they have a 60 and I want to go, that's okay. Okay, because yes, we're competitors, but we're not selling the exact same item. So they don't feel mutual interdependence. They can kind of do their own thing, if you will, and they can set some policies without consideration of rivals, okay? So they can have their return policies, for example, different from their competitors. There is some product differentiation in monopolistic competition. There are product variations. Everything is a little bit different, okay? So what this means is they work on what we call non-price competition, things like product quality, things like service, perhaps even advertising. Now it's probably a good idea to give you an idea on what an example of a monopolistic competition is. And I use kind of two examples here. The first one's fast food, okay? If you think about fast food, there are a large number of burger places. You can go to McDonald's, Wendy's, Burger King, Five Guys, you know, whole bunch of different places where you can go get a burger. And no one would argue that those burgers are identical. In fact, most of us would argue they're very different, okay? What that is, those are those product variations, okay? And then what they compete on is some things such as product quality, okay? That used to, you know, and I'm sure it still is, Wendy's big claim to fame. I mean, Wendy's was kind of the latecomer, if you will, to the McDonald's Burger King duopoly. And what they always argued is that, hey, our burgers are better. And now you've got Five Guys and some of those other burger places, Shake Shack perhaps, that even take it a step further and argue that their product quality is better. So that's one example. I'd use fast food, okay? And then keep in mind, within fast food, if you think about it, yeah, I've listed all the burger places, but then you can go to, you know, the Subway places, Jimmy John's and Subway. You can go to perhaps the Mexican places, Taco Bell, what have you. And so all of a sudden you start thinking about, fast food. There's a lot of different places you can get. Some of them are very close substitutes, if you will, Burger King, McDonald's maybe, and some of them are a little bit further afield, perhaps Taco Bell and Wendy's. It's relatively easy to get in. Okay, it's relatively easy to get in. Oh, one other item that I should mention, my other example of a monopolistic competitive industry is the mall. If you think about the mall, there are a lot of places where you can go to buy blue jeans. Okay, you can go to LL Bean, you can go to Eddie Bauer, you can go to JCPenney, you can go to, the Gap, you can go to Old Navy, you can, all of a sudden there's a lot of places where you can go get jeans. They're all a little bit different. Okay, whether it's their style, whether it's how they're cut, whether it's the quality of the materials, what have you, example of product quality. So all of a sudden, there's a lot of places where you can get jeans at the mall or t-shirts at the mall or what have you, but they're all a little bit different. And then finally, market power. They have some, and I have here, it's relatively minimal. Burger King can charge whatever they want. But does it have to be within shouting distance, if you will, or close to what's being offered at McDonald's or Wendy's or one of the other places? And the answer is yes. So they have some market power, but relatively speaking, it's minimal. So what that means for us is that means the demand curve is relatively elastic. So if you think about it in the grand scheme of things, it's kind of flattish. Okay, it's kind of flattish. And keep in mind, because the demand curve is downward sloping, the marginal revenue curve is downward sloping. And the reason is because they have a few rivals. McDonald's has a handful, Burger King has a handful, Taco Bell even has a handful, but the rivals are not perfect substitutes. Okay, those of us that have had that have kids or know, we have a preference. And when you're going down the interstate or driving or what have you, it's time to pull over for lunch. We all know there's a handful of places you can pull over, and they're not perfect substitutes. If you're anything like the SAS household, you have a tendency to go into one of those places more so than the others. Okay, so they're not perfect substitutes. Now, the elasticity depends upon the number of rivals and the degree of differentiation. So how many people are there? How many competitors, if you will, are there? And how differentiated are they? Okay, so that's going to determine how elastic that demand curve is. Questions so far? Now, for price and output determination, we are still in marginal revenue equals marginal cost. So this rule that we started looking at a couple of weeks ago for pure competition and what have you still holds. Okay, so we're going to look for where does marginal revenue equal marginal cost. And the short run profits and losses are going to depend entirely upon how the curves are drawn. Okay, how they're placed, what have you, where do they exist? So if I put everything up here, notice I have a downward slope in demand curve. It's relatively elastic, so it's kind of flattish. Okay, I have a downward sloping marginal revenue curve. Same reason why under Monopoly I had a downward sloping curve. I look for where those two cross, where they're equal. Because remember, I'm looking for where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. Okay, and then I can drop a line down and that'll show me how much to produce. And I can draw a line up and find the price. That's the price I'm going to charge. Now, as we can see here in this particular graph, there are profits. That box there, go ahead and that box there is the profits. Okay, And my perfect example of this always is you see one fast food place come up on one corner. Inevitably, what do you see pop up on 2 or 3 of the other corners? Another fast food place. Why? McDonald's goes in. All of a sudden, they're making profits. At which case, Burger King or Wendy's or whomever, Five Guys goes, God, they're making money. Why don't we go compete against them? Okay. So the short run, those profits and losses depend entirely upon the curve placement, but profits attract entrants. So McDonald's goes in, puts a place on the corner, they're making money. Next thing you know, Burger King and Wendy's are going, I want a piece of that pie. Okay. So what then happens is in the long run, as new firms enter the market, as Burger King comes across the street and Wendy's comes across the, across the street or at the corner or whatever, the market demand curve shifts leftward and becomes even more elastic. Okay. The reason why this occurs is each firm now has a smaller share of the total demand and faces more products that are close substitutes. Think about it. You pulled off the interstate, there's only a McDonald's there. You're eating at McDonald's, kids. Okay. But what happens is a Burger King goes across the street or a Wendy's or a Five Guys or whatever, all of a sudden, there's still approximately the same number of people cruising down the interstate, stopping off for lunch, whatever. So what's going to happen is there's going to be a smaller share of the total demand they're each going to collect. And there's more products that are close substitutes. So what's going to happen, this is my original graph, is the demand curve is going to move to the left, which is what it did, and become more elastic. It's going to get even flatter. Okay. And then when that occurs, the demand curve. Okay. Pardon me, the demand curve is to the left and more elastic. Now what's going to happen is the marginal revenue curve is going to shift to the left, or I should say rotate in some way, shape, or form, and also become more elastic. Now, quick note, and it's no guarantee it's going to work this way. I just drew it this way to make my life and my explanation easier. I had both the white and the gold marginal revenue curves hit the marginal cost curve at the same spot, so I didn't have to worry about the quantity changing. But notice what happens is this occurs, the price falls, the price goes down, and the profits get smaller. So what do you see happen? McDonald's starts on a corner. They're doing really well. Burger King goes across the street. The demand curve moves a little bit to the left, becomes more elastic, profits go down. Okay, why? Because some people that used to go to McDonald's are now going to Burger King, but there's still profits. So then what happens is Wendy's moves in. And as Wendy's moves in, the demand curve moves further to the left, marginal revenue, and becomes more elastic, marginal revenue does. And eventually you end up with a curves that look like this. So what happens is curve moved to the left, marginal revenue, profits got smaller. These profits here are going to continue to get smaller and smaller and smaller until finally they get competed away. Finally, you've got that fast food place on every corner, okay? And you end up with a curve that looks like this. Notice marginal revenue still equals marginal cost. That's where we draw, but notice when we go up to the demand curve, okay, it's right there at the minimum of the average total cost curve, and there's no profits. Now, that doesn't mean McDonald's is not making money. They're doing well, okay? It means they're not earning more than their opportunity cost for investing the money and having the risk and what have you. They're earning what we call a fair rate of return, to use the discussion from last week, okay? They're earning a fair rate of return. So that's where we end up ultimately. Questions? Now, some real world complications, okay? Product differentiation cannot be duplicated. Okay. What do I mean by that? There are sometimes, I mean, a gas station's another example of a monopolistically competitive industry. Okay. There may be some sort of barriers to entry. Okay. Things like how easy is it to get in and out of a gas station? Okay. I don't know if y'all recall, but there used to be a Burger King down at 81 and 220, right where you get on and off 81 there from Allegheny and what have you. And that Burger King never seems to do as well as the McDonald's down the street, which is, you know, a block down, or what was it, Hardee's across the street. Okay. And the reason is because it was a pain in the butt to get in and out of. Okay. So even though they're right there trying to compete with McDonald's, Hardee's, what have you, there are some things that cause a barrier to entry. And sometimes it's as simple as how easy is it to get in and out. Okay. I don't know if y'all are in this situation, but you probably have your favorite gas station. Okay. Not because you're enamored with their gas, although they may have the best price, but it may also very well be it's the easiest to get in and out of on the way to work, the way to school, the way to wherever, you know, picking up the kids. So you end up pulling into that gas station all the time. So there are some things where there are some barriers to entry. Okay. There are also industries where losses will persist. Okay. Theoretically, if they're losing, they should get out of the industry. Okay. And the example I use here is businesses. Okay. And the one that comes immediately to mind are things like a bakery. Okay. My dad was a baker. His dad was a baker. I'm a baker. I own a bakery. Yeah, I'm in competition with the bakery at Kroger and, you know, Safeway and all those other places, but it's a way of life. So I'm not going to go out of business. I'm not going to, you know, stop doing what my family has been doing for generations. So there are situations where you may have losses that persist. Questions? Now, when we've talked about each of these industries, we've always talked about them in terms of productive and allocative efficiency. And the first one is price is greater than the minimum of the average total cost curve. They charge, McDonald's, Burger King, Wendy's, charge a higher price than a competitive price in the long run. Okay. But they only achieve a normal profit. Now I'm gonna scoot back here to my graph in here. Notice the minimum of the average total cost curve is right there. And it's not, I mean, it's not much lower, but it's a little bit lower. Okay. Could we spend less at McDonald's, or could they cost them less than McDonald's and Burger King? Yes. Okay. But, okay, in order to do that, we'd have to give something up. And I'll talk about that here in a minute. So price is not the minimum of the average total cost curve. Price also is bigger than the marginal cost curve. Now, once again, I'm going to go back. Price is greater. The marginal cost is down here to produce this output. The price is up here. So once again, price is greater than the marginal cost. So what that's telling us is that we value the output greater than the marginal cost to produce the output. The additional cost to produce a burger is relatively, you know, is just the burger. Okay. But we value it greater than that marginal cost. And so we're willing to pay more than that marginal cost. Okay. Which also means then that we're taking resources away from other things to make that item. In this case, burgers. So we can see here that price is greater than the minimum of the average total cost, and price is greater than the marginal cost to produce that particular item. What that means, okay, is, and it's hard to tell right now, but especially if you tried to go through the drive-through at a lot of these places, but monopolistically competitive industries are overcrowded with firms. We have too many burger places, folks. each of which is underutilized. You go into the Hardee's there in Clifton Forge most days, most of the time, other than, maybe a half an hour during a dinner rush or a lunch rush, there's nobody, you can walk right up and the people are there working, maybe cleaning up, maybe doing something. But could we make restaurants a lot more efficient? And the answer is yes. Okay. Could they then offer their goods, their product at a lower cost? The answer is yes. Okay. So if we had bigger places and fewer of them, could they do it more efficiently? And the answer is heck yeah. The problem is monopolistically competitive are not necessarily bad because it gives us product variety. Okay. I mean, the alternative would easily be you have two choices. Choice one, you only have McDonald's and Burger King. So you have two competitors. Choice two, you have what we have today. You've got Burger King, you've got McDonald's, you've got Hardee's, you've got Wendy's, you've got Five Guys, you've got Shake Shack, you've got, boom, 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 boom. Hey, all those competitors make it inefficient. But it's not necessarily bad from an economics perspective because we have a lot of variety. We don't have to go to Burger King and McDonald's every day. We can alternate between a whole bunch of different places. And by the way, if I want, we could have included, the Taco Bells of the world in there and all those other, chicken places, Chick-fil-A and what have you. And we could have had even a lot bigger of, a fast food group. So the beauty of monopolistic competition is, yes, we're paying a little bit more for those burgers or for that fried chicken or for that, whatever. But it gives us the opportunity that, we don't have to go to the same place every day for lunch or for dinner or what have you. Questions? So how do firms try to improve? Okay, we're in this situation where profits are going to get competed away. We're going to earn just what we call a normal profit. We're going to earn a fair rate of return. Okay, one of the things is product differentiation. Okay, it is probably the redeeming quality of monopolistically competitive industries. The beauty is a Big Mac and a Whopper and a triple or a double at Wendy's or whatever, they're all so different. Okay, that's probably one of the redeeming qualities. The beauty of going to the mall to get a pair of jeans is we all know that Levi's and Gap and Eddie Bauer and Land's End and Old Navy, they're all going to, and JCPenney are all going to have jeans, but they're all going to be different. Okay, maybe in style, maybe in color, what have you. That product's differentiation implies a less elastic demand curve. The whole thing that companies are trying to do, folks, when they advertise and come up with these new products, is they're saying, look, my demand curve is very elastic. Okay. What I want to do is I want to advertise and tell everybody how my product is so much better. Why? Because I want the demand curve to be more inelastic. Because if the demand curve is more inelastic, people are going to demand my product. What I want is I want the kids in the back seats to demand we go to McDonald's because they have the great toys. I want the kids in the back seat to demand that, or, that we go to, maybe the Gap because they've got better quality jeans or more stylish jeans, or perhaps, A&E or American Eagle or Abercrombie or wherever, because their jeans are more stylish. Mom, I can't wear Gap jeans. That's what old people wear. Let's go to American Eagle, or let's go to, so part of that product differentiation is to make that demand curve more inelastic. okay, or as I have here, less elastic. And it also allows more diverse tastes are satisfied and greater consumer choice. So monopolistic competition isn't necessarily bad. It also leads to product development. Now, there are very few of us that remember this. There was a time where McDonald's was trying to sell pizzas. Okay. Not all product development is necessarily a good thing. Okay. In fact, through COVID here, I know there's some discussion in some of these places. Should they even be selling, McDonald's? And I'm no, should they have salads? I mean, granted, it satisfies a need and provides us with choice. But if you really want a salad, you're probably going to Panera or whatever. You're probably not going, oh, McDonald's has the greatest salads. Let's go there. Okay, so, but it does lead to product development. And also then it leads to a lot of advertising on TV for the commercials so the kids will demand to go to McDonald's so they get the toy. Mom, have you seen the toy that's in the Happy Meal these days? Okay. So those are the things that firms do to try to earn more than a normal profit. Any questions before we switch over to oligopoly? If not, oligopoly is the last of our four market structures. It's becoming the most common. And I didn't post any articles on this. I didn't have a discussion board on it. I mean, we talked about it a little bit with monopoly. Firms today are more and more becoming oligopolies. Okay. What's happening is, especially big companies, they don't want to be a monopoly. They don't want to be the only one, because when they're the only one, that invites regulatory scrutiny. Okay. If I've got a number of companies, okay, in oligopolies, when you think of oligopoly, think like 2, 3, 4 different companies, competitors. Okay. Give you an example right off the bat here, cell phones. Okay. You really have, I would argue, 3 national carriers at this point, AT&T, Verizon, and T-Mobile. Okay. Now, wherever you go in the country, there's probably 1 other or 2 other little ones. Okay. Back in the day, and I don't know if they still offer it. There used to be Intellos. So, there's usually even 1 or 2 more local ones, whatever, but it's a few large firms that dominate the market. And companies today like oligopoly because it means I don't have to worry about the regulators so much, because I can always point, hey, I have competition. There's, if I'm T-Mobile, I can say, look, you got AT&T and Verizon, okay, at a minimum. The products might be differentiated or they might be homogeneous. Okay. Many of the cell phone companies I was using just a moment ago as my example, they try to differentiate themselves based upon, service, dropped calls, what have you. There's other industries where it's very homogeneous. Things like the steel industry. Okay. The steel industry is an oligopoly. Okay. But for the most part, a ton of hot rolled steel is a ton of hot rolled steel. And there's not a whole heck of a lot of difference. Okay. The automakers are an oligopoly. Keep in mind, they have differentiated products. Nobody would argue that a GM or a Toyota or a Ford or a Hyundai or what have you are in any way similar. Okay. Or a BMW, what have you. So the products could be differentiated. They could be homogeneous. The key here is they also have mutual interdependence. Okay. And here is where Mr. Sass, once again, he's done this a number of times this semester, talks out of both sides of his mouth. They have substantial market power, but it's also limited. GM can charge whatever they want, but there's Ford and there's Dodge and there's competitors there. So they can charge whatever they want, but only within reason. I mean, only within reason. And the reason why there's an oligopoly is there is some sort of a barrier to entry. There's something that prevents very few firms to be in that industry. Cell phones are a perfect example. Okay. In order to compete against AT&T, T-Mobile, and Verizon, think of all the cell phone towers you'd have to put up. Okay. Something as simple as having to put up all those cell phone towers around the country is a barrier to entry. It means that it's going to be very hard for the next company to come up and create a nationwide network and compete against those three. So for the most part, do those three have to worry too much about, a new national competitor? And the answer is no. Okay. Now, do they have to worry about the Intelloses of the world or what have you, the little local ones? Yeah. Okay. But, and they will piggyback, if you will, on AT&T or Verizon or one of the other big companies. I mean, they'll piggyback on their network. But for the most part, they don't have to worry about them going out and setting up their entire thing. So oligopolies have some form of a barrier to entry. And that's the reason why we have oligopolies. There's something that prevents. In the case of like steel, it's a large capital intensive business. To build a steel plant takes a ton of money. To come up with a new auto company, it's going to take a ton of money. Now, Tesla was able to do it, but they kind of carved out a little niche for themselves in electric. Okay. Now, there are two ways that we measure industry structure. One is the concentration ratio. And what we talk about here is the 4-firm concentration ratio. And what that is it's the percentage of industry sales accounted for by the 4 largest firms. Okay. So what we do is we take industry sales and we say company 1 has 25% of the industry, company 2 has 15% of the industry, company 3 has 10%, company 4 has 10%. So those 4 companies have 40, 50, 60% of the market. The other 40% is, with other competitors. And when 4 firms have more than 40%, we say they have an oligopoly. Okay, so in this industry that I just made up here, where it's 60%, do I have an oligopoly? And the answer is heck yes. Okay. Now, the problem with concentration ratios is they pertain to the nation as a whole, and the relevant market may be local. Okay. A perfect example is things like concrete, asphalt. Okay. Concrete is 100% a local business. Concrete trucks do not deliver concrete outside of, and I'm going to make up a number here, 100-mile range. That's it. Okay. So the competitors are only within a small area. So you may only have 2 choices to go to get your concrete poured for your driveway or the asphalt for the street. Okay. But concentration ratios pertain to the nation as a whole. So even though, you and I would go, God, they're an oligopoly, I've got to go to, one of these 2 companies to get my concrete poured. Nationwide, they're tiny. Okay. And so it's not really appropriate. So the relevant market may be local, which it is for things like concrete and asphalt and things like that, even though the concentration ratio pertains to the market as a whole. And it ignores inter-industry competition. Okay. And just to give you an example, and it doesn't really fit, but it kind of illustrates the point. Okay. Back when I was a kid in the 60s and 70s, bumpers were made out of metal. They were made out of steel. And if you were a bumper maker back then, you'd go, plastic? Who's going to protect a $30,000 today, a $40,000 or a $100,000 car with a bumper made of plastic? Come on. Okay. Yet you go out today and almost all the bumpers are made of plastic. Only exception is really trucks. Okay. Did the metal bumper makers think they really had to worry about the cheap plastic, flimsy, bumpers on cars? No. And then next thing you know, oh my goodness, bumpers are made out of plastic. Okay. It excludes imports. We have 3 major domestic producers of cars, and I'm using domestic here and kind of biting my tongue a little bit with Dodge Chrysler, which is no longer Dodge Chrysler. I think it's Fiat or something. But, when you look at the auto industry, you have Ford and GM, so their concentration ratio in Dodge, let's suppose it's a US, is big. But then you start throwing in Toyotas and Hondas and BMWs and Mercedes and what have you, and it excludes all those imports. So all of a sudden the concentration ratio may not apply. And finally, it fails to measure market power. Okay. 4 firms that have 100% or 1 firm that has 100%, they're all kind of viewed the same. Okay. And that 1 firm that has, I have here 100%, obviously maybe have 95% or something like that. It may not have all that much market power. Okay. It doesn't take that into account. So those are the problems with our concentration ratio. And that's one way to measure an oligopoly. And it's the 4 firm concentration ratio over 40%. The other way is the Herfindahl index. And what the Herfindahl index is the sum of the squared market shares of all the firms in an industry. So it includes all the firms, and then it squares them. So, for example, okay, if there was 1 firm that had 100% of the market, 100 squared is 10 grand. If there were 4 firms that each had 25% of the market, okay, it'd be 25 squared plus 25 squared plus 25 squared plus 25 squared, which is 2,500. And finally, if there were 100 firms, each with 1% of the market, it'd be 1 squared plus 1 squared plus 1 squared, and it'd be 100. And this kind of gives us the range. A Herfindahl index, the highest it would be is 10 grand. Theoretically, it could be less than 100, but if it was, we wouldn't even be counting it. Most of the time, we're looking for numbers. I've got a slide here in a second. In this middle range, okay? 2,500, 3,500, 4,000, things like that is usually what we're looking at. And once again, the problem with this is it tells us nothing about competition. Okay, these 4 firms could be fierce competitors. These 100 firms could say live and let live. So it tells us nothing about how competitive these industries are. Okay, now there's a table in your book. It's not going to be 11.2 on page 231, but there are some tables that provide some Herfindahl indexes for various industries. Give you an example of how it applies in banking, and it applies in every industry different. A merger of banks. So if one bank wanted to buy another bank, and these are old rules, so they may be changed under the Biden administration, what have you. These are old rules, but it gives you an idea. A merger of banks is not challenged on competitive grounds if the Herfindahl index after the merger is less than 1,800 and the index rises by less than 200 points in the relevant banking markets. So what they do when they approve bank mergers, okay? And what was the one? BB&T and SunTrust, okay? What they start looking at is, hey, can these companies merge, or is that going to decrease competition? So what they do is they look at the Herfindahl index, and if after the merger it's less than 1,800 and the index rose by less than 200 points, they're going to let that merger go through. Now I thought, I want to go, Oh, sorry about that. I thought I had probably here and not showing up. I had how it impacts the banking industry. Looking at different cities around the country and with their Herfindahl index. Now, the problem is I have been able to give you a nice little snapshot of pure competition and told you exactly how things work. I've been able to give you a nice little picture of monopoly and how things work. I've been able to provide earlier in class today a picture of monopolistic competition and tell you how it works. When it comes to oligopoly, all bets are off. Okay. So what we have when we look at oligopolies is we don't have one picture. I can't put up one graph. I can say maybe they operate this way or maybe they operate that way, but I can't put up one graph and explain it. And the reason is for a number of reasons, if you will. First off, there are too many different types of oligopolies. Okay. There are some oligopolies where they're selling identical products. There are some where they're selling differentiated products. There's some where they're selling to the consumer, you and I. There's others where they're selling only to business, okay, like steel. So there's just too many different types of oligopolies that I can't draw one graph, put it up here, and say that's what it looks like. I can't do it. Firms are interdependent. So it becomes very hard for firms. Firms can't predict what their rivals are going to do. Therefore, how do they predict demand? Without demand, they can't come up with marginal revenue. And without marginal revenue, they can't find profit maximization. So all of a sudden, because Ford and GM are interdependent, it's hard to know what your competitor is going to do. Or Intel, let's use T-Mobile, AT&T, and Verizon. They don't know what their rivals are going to do. Therefore, it's very difficult to predict what their demand is going to look like. And if they can't come up with that downward sloping demand curve, they don't know what their marginal revenue curve is. And without marginal revenue, they know what their costs are. They know what their marginal cost is, but they can't find profit maximization. So all those things we talked about in pure competition, monopolistic competition, and monopoly, all of a sudden kind of fall apart. All those nice graphs kind of fall apart. So what we end up with is 2 or 3 or 4 different pictures of how oligopolies work. One is based on the old prisoner's dilemma. Okay. And here you go and you watch the TV shows, what have you. And they always take the, they take the 2 suspects in, but they never let them sit in the same room. They always put them in separate rooms. Okay. And the reason why they do this is they've got 2 prisoners. They've got prisoner Y here. They've got prisoner X here. Okay. If they both go into their own rooms and stay silent, saying, I'm not going to, tattle on my partner, what happens is the police tend to get them on some minor crime, some minor technicality, and only put them away for 1 year. But the fear is always these 2 boxes. Okay? If prisoner Y confesses and prisoner X stays silent, okay, what's going to happen is guy Y, individual Y, is going to what we call plea bargain and say, hey, I'll tell you what happened, but you got to let me off easy, or you got to let me off total. Okay. And since you don't know what the other guy's saying because he's in the other room, the question is, how much can I trust him? And is he going to tell, but that's not the truth. So what happens is these 2 guys, the fear is if I say nothing and he talks up, I'm going down for the entire thing. And that's not the way it happened. So what those cop shows always do is they put them in separate rooms. They say the other guy's singing like a bird. He's saying you did the whole thing. You better, tell us what happened or you're going down for it all, man. And the next thing you know, both the guys confess. They both end up with 5 years. And you go, okay, Mr. Sass, I've been seeing that for years. I know how it works. That makes sense. What the heck does this have to do with business? Okay, I understand. Think about it this way. And the way I always use this example is Pepsi and Coke. Okay, think about firm one up here being Pepsi. And you could put in a whole bunch of different firms. I'm just, trying to make it something we can relate to. In Coke. Is there any really reason why Pepsi needs to advertise? And the answer is no. At this point in time, we all know what Pepsi is. We all know what Coke is. Everybody in this class today is, for the most part, an either or. You're either a Pepsi drinker or you're a Coke drinker. Now, might there be situations where, okay, you choose the other one? Sure. But most of us have a preference. Most of us go first for the preference. And what does the waiter or the wait staff always say? They always say, I'm sorry, either we have Coke products, you've asked for Pepsi, we have Coke products. Is that okay? What have you? 99% of the time, I think we say yes. Okay. There's really no need for Pepsi and Coke to advertise. We know what they have. So if neither of them advertised, they'd make a ton of money. But the problem is, if Pepsi advertises and Coke doesn't, my fear is that my competitor is going to advertise. Okay. And Pepsi's fear is that Coke advertises. And so pretty soon what you end up with is you end up down here where both of the firms are advertising and their profits are smaller. Why? Because they're spending all this money on advertising. For the longest time, the biggest benefit for cigarette makers is that as we've told them, and they still can't, to my knowledge, they can't advertise. They don't care. That's just more money for them. Why is it more money for them? Because since I'm selling Marlboro or Camel or whatever I'm selling these days, I don't know what cigarette brands there are, and I don't have to worry about the competitors, advertising and stealing some of my customers, I get to keep that extra money as profits. It worked out really well for them. Hey, as long as you ban all of us from advertising, that's a sweet deal. That's a sweet deal. So that's how it applies here in economics, business, what have you. So that's one model, game theory. Another model is what we call the Kink's demand curve. Okay, and the Kink's demand curve excludes things like collusion and cartels. Oh, and there are some other oligopoly models, collusion, cartels, and price leadership. I'll talk about each of those probably still today. But the way the Kink's demand curve looks is like this. We've got this downward slope in demand curve. We've got a downward slope in marginal revenue curve. Okay. And keep in mind, we still have marginal revenue equal marginal cost, and it didn't quite work, but it's still going to go there. And now the key is, okay, if we raise our price, Pepsi and Coke almost always have, they almost always have sales. Let's be realistic about that. But other than that, their non-sale price is almost always the same. But the problem is, if I raise my price, if I'm Pepsi, and once again, let's talk in terms of Pepsi and Coke, just because it's something we can relate to. If Pepsi goes to raise their price, Coke will be very tempted to say, go ahead, raise your price. I'm going to leave my price where it is, and I'm going to take your customers, because there's some people that will switch between the two, that are, to use an economic term, indifferent between them, and we'll take those customers. So if you raise your price, if Pepsi raises their price, nobody follows, and the demand curve kind of flips there, rotates, and becomes more elastic. But if Pepsi cuts their price, Coke is going to say, heck no, you're not going to steal my customers. I'm cutting my price right with you. So what you end up with is a kinked demand curve and a kinked marginal revenue curve. So there is a kink at the current market price. Okay. And what happens is if you try to raise your price, competitors don't go along, and so your demand becomes very elastic. If you start cutting your price, you're not going to get any more customers because your competitor is going to cut it right with you. So now you have two different demand curves, and those two different demand curves give you a marginal revenue. It would give it, why is it called a kinked demand curve? Because the demand curve has a kink. Okay, but notice what happens to the marginal revenue curve. Marginal revenue curve now looks like that. And what that means is there's a lot of different marginal cost curves in there. Okay, and marginal revenue equals marginal cost. Hey, all of these different marginal cost curves hit it. They all go up to the demand curve and read across to come up with the price. So all these competitors, even though they have different costs, all are charging the same price, which a lot of times you find in oligopoly. Okay, and you also find firms, some are big, some are really small. How can Dr. Pepper, Dr. Pepper 7-Up still compete? Because maybe their marginal cost curve is up here, maybe it's higher, but than Pepsi's and Coke's, which is maybe down here, but that's okay because we're all looking at the same marginal revenue, same demand, what have you. And for the most part, we're charging either the same or very similar prices. So the reason why it looks this way is because what's going to, if I increase price, nobody goes along. If I decrease price, everybody follows me. So therefore, prices don't change. Why change the price? And the idea is live and let live. Okay. And the other implication of this is substantial cost changes have little impact on prices and output. So costs may change a lot, but that marginal cost curve, and I'm going to skip back here, that marginal cost curve, okay, or all those marginal cost curves, they all lead to the same price. They all lead to the same spot. So changing in costs have no impact on prices and output. Now, from an economics perspective, we have some issues. One of the problems with the kinked demand curve is we cannot, how did Pepsi and Coke figure out what to charge? And the problem is our model doesn't explain that. We don't know. We don't know how they get to that price or that quantity. We can explain why it might stay there, but we can't explain how they got there in the first place. And then the second part is oligopoly pricing is not quite, if our absolute kinked demand curve model held, they should never change their price, but they do. So our pricing is not as rigid as what we would expect. Okay. So that's what our kinked demand curve looks like. And like I said, the problem is we can't explain how we got that price. Okay. And the implication for this is the price doesn't change. But when we look at reality, we know it does. So that's one of the models we use. Another model we use is what we call collusion. And this is firms that reach an agreement to fix prices and divide market share. Now, quick note here, this is your Mr. Sass, Tuesday afternoon, how to stay out of jail card. It is illegal to collude. Let there be no mistake. It is illegal to collude. You can't get together with your competitors and fix prices. But it makes a lot of sense for them to try. Okay. Assume firms have the same cost structure, which, especially since we're talking big firms, whatever, it's easy to do. Maybe they're all dealing with the same unions, so they have the same labor contracts. They're all buying steel from the same set of companies, so they all have the similar costs there. Okay. They all built their plants at about the same time. The cost of new machinery is the same for both of them. All of a sudden, they have very similar cost structures. And if the competitors lower their price, I'm going to have to match them. So the answer to this is to collude, get together, split the market, agree on price, and all earn the reward. Now, I will tell you, probably every other year, okay, you'll hear of somebody colluding, okay? And the companies get fined. Some of the people usually get thrown in jail for a while, what have you, because it is illegal. But what they're trying to do, to be, from an economics perspective, is deal with this oligopoly where, hey, if somebody cuts their price, the only way that I can do anything about it is to cut my price, and all we're going to do is lower profits. Now, we have to compare. The question that always comes up is, well, what about OPEC? Okay, OPEC is the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. They get together, they meet usually at least twice a year, okay? And they meet and discuss how much they're going to produce and how much they're going to charge. Isn't that collusion? And the answer is yes. But they're a cartel, they're countries. So can OPEC get together and do that? And the answer is yes, they can. Okay. Can companies in the US get together and do that? And the answer is no, they can't, because that's collusion. Collusion is illegal. It's not illegal for OPEC to create the cartel. Okay. It's international. It's between countries. Example is OPEC. The problem is it doesn't work in the long run. Okay. And even OPEC found this out. Okay. When OPEC works to keep right now it's interesting, they would love a high price. A high price provides them with more income for their countries to buy more goods, what have you. The real problem with this is right now the US. Okay. And what happened is those high prices encouraged us to find ways to get oil out of shale, okay, called fracking, okay? They didn't count on us necessarily as a competitor, okay? So what happened is the price went up and up and up and up. And at some point, the US came in through fracking in shale, okay, is now a competitor. In fact, the US produces the most, and I'm going to say the most, and we might be number 2 now. We produce the most oil. We, drill the most oil in the world. We have more, we're drilling more than the Saudis or the Russians or what have you. Why? Because of oil shale. And the problem with cartels is, in the long run, or collusion, is it doesn't work. Okay? It inevitably will fall apart. Okay? From an economics perspective, keep in mind, one could even argue collusion should not be illegal. It is. Don't go to jail. It is illegal, but from an economics perspective, we'd say it's going to fall apart. Now, it might fall apart, in the long run, which might be longer than we care to admit to, but it will fall apart. And the reason is things like demand differences. Okay. And the best example here is oil. You and I think of oil as oil is oil. Oil is not all the same. Okay. There is light sweet and heavy sour. Okay. And the Venezuelans, for the most part, have heavy sour. And what that means is it's got a lot of sulfur in it. And basically, the only refineries that can refine it are in the US. Why? Because of where Venezuela is located, we had a habit back in the 50s, 60s, 70s to import it into the Gulf Coast and refine it. Okay. Well, there are differences because of that. There are differences in the demand for oil. It depends whether it's light sweet or heavy sour. So there's differences in demand. Okay, there could very well be cost differences. Okay, the US, the cost to produce a barrel of shale oil in the US is probably somewhere between 40 and 60 bucks. The Saudis can do it for like 5. Okay, they have a huge cost advantage on us. Okay, so those things start to come into play. The number of firms come into play. It might be easy to collude with 1 or 2. You know, if you only have 2 or 3 firms, might you get them to agree and whatever? And the answer is yes. In the case of broader numbers, it's really tough. And the real problem is cheating. I've been following the oil industry since the 80s. It's hilarious, folks. As soon as wherever OPEC meets, when they walk out of that meeting, I can read a report that will tell me, hey, the Saudis have agreed to produce X million barrels, and they are going to cheat by this many. Okay. And it will have laid out there how many barrels every country is going to cheat by. It's like, why are you colluding and doing all this if everybody knows you're going to cheat as soon as you walk out of the room? Okay. What OPEC didn't account for is potential entry. Keep in mind, the U.S. had no fracking until 20 years ago, 15 years ago. Okay. All we had was, whatever we had in Prudhoe in Alaska or Texas that we were able to, get out of the ground with traditional drilling. They didn't count on us finding oil and being able to frack for it in the Dakotas and West Virginia and Pennsylvania and Ohio and what have you. And then finally, there's legal obstacles. It is illegal to collude. Okay. And things like antitrust. So that's a method or a theory on oligopoly. Another theory is price leadership. And this is kind of a gentleman's agreement by which you coordinate price without collusion. And there are a bunch of examples. You can look at the auto industry back in the day. You can look at airlines. Airlines used to be hilarious. One of the airlines would want to increase their price. Okay. So what they would do is on a day where they knew the demand was going to be low, not a lot of people make a reservation perhaps, and keep in mind, this is before internet and what have you. Maybe not a lot of people make a reservation over the weekend. So on Friday night at midnight, one of the airlines would raise their price on a flight. LA to New York, we're going to raise the price from $500 to $600. And then we sit back and we watch. And if we're one airline and the other airlines follow us along by Monday morning, we leave the price stick at $500. The new price is now $600. If nobody follows us, we cut the price back down to $500. Come Monday morning, nobody knows any different. Okay. Were the airlines doing that? Heck yes. Okay. They were doing that into the 80s and 90s. Okay. They were coordinating their prices without collusion, and they do it overnight, typically overnight. And they'd announce their price through one of the systems they used, and nobody would be the smart, nobody would know. The autos used to do this where, and the autos didn't do it with the largest firm. They alternated. When you go back to the 50s and 60s, it was hilarious. There were basically 3 big companies. Okay. One could argue 4 or 5, possibly. I mean, there was Ford, GM. Okay. There was Dodge. there was Jeep. And at the time, there was also AMC, American Motors. Okay. And I'm into the 60s here, maybe early 70s. And what would happen is they'd alternate. And one year Ford would go first and announce what their prices were going to be. Okay. And they'd go, oh, we're coming up with a new, it's a new model year for the F-150. So we're going to raise the price by $3,000 or $2,000 or whatever, $200, whatever the number was. And then 2 weeks later, GM would come out and go, well, Ford increased the price of the F-150 by $250, but we haven't upgraded our, GMC Colorado lately, so we can't get $250. We're only going to raise our price by $150. So they'd raise their price by $150. And then Dodge would come along and go, well, we haven't raised we're going to go up by $150. And AMC and Jeep just kind of were along for the ride. Okay. And then the next year, it'd be another company. So one year GM would take the lead, the next year Ford would take the lead, then the next year another company. And so it wasn't that the largest would, but one of the firms would take the lead one year, and then the next year somebody else would take the lead. Okay. These types of things can be used when prices changes infrequently. Okay. And they can communicate the price change. They'd have a huge press announcement saying, hey, we're coming up with new prices for X, Y, and Z product. And part of the reason they could also do this is because of cost plus pricing. Okay. GM and Ford and Dodge all had labor through the UAW. For the most part, all their contracts and prices were the same. Okay. They were getting steel from one or two or three different steel companies. All their prices for materials were the same. They were getting the seats from same couple of, all of a sudden, if all their costs are the same, they are all going to come up with close to the same price. Okay. Because if the costs are the same, as long as they have similar markups, it leads to very similar prices. Another model. Okay. The problem with oligopolies is price is greater than the marginal cost and price is greater than the minimum of the average total cost curve. So we do not have efficiency. Okay. We do not have efficiency. And so oligopolists hate price competition. They want to work hard to differentiate their product, even if they're making steel. They want to make their steel in some way different than the competitors because they don't want to be able to, they don't want to just be competing on price. Okay. Now there are some economists, some people that argue monopoly is even better than oligopoly. Okay. Because at least a monopoly is regulated. The reason why firms today love to be in an oligopoly. In fact, most firms, nobody will come out and admit it, but most firms love to be in an oligopoly. And the reason is because if they're the only one, they're going to get regulated. They're going to get a lot of scrutiny. But if there's a whole bunch, if they've got some friends nearby, Verizon, AT&T, T-Mobile, okay, for the most part, nobody's going to regulate them because they're going to say there's competition. Okay. So some would argue that monopoly is better. At least you're going to have them regulated. Okay. Now there's all the other side of that, if you will, is that it may not be that bad. Okay. And the biggest reason is foreign competition. And here, the example we would use is autos. You go back to the 50s and 60s, and I think everybody would agree, the products coming out of American manufacturers was garbage. So what happened is, yeah, they had the market to themselves. And then there were some startup companies. People made fun of them, but they were great companies and great cars. They were called things like Toyota and Honda. And at the time, Nissan was called Datsun. Okay. And so what happened is they thought they had a nice little oligopoly, Ford, GM, Chrysler, what have you. And then they realized, oh, crud, we've got these competitors called Toyota, Ford, or pardon me, Toyota, Honda, Datsun. We got to pick up our game. In fact, there was a time back in the 80s where almost all those companies disappeared. I mean, almost all those companies disappeared before the the Fords and the Chryslers and what have you. Chrysler was in bankruptcy. AMC is gone. Jeep got taken over. So, I mean, they were in bad shape there for a while. Foreign competition is the reason why. And the other thing is we think oligopolies price less than full profit maximization. They don't want to attract entrants, okay? You know, they don't want people to come in. And keep in mind, when they try to do it, and I'd use OPEC as an example, it sounds really good. Oh, we price the product right at the peak. You price it right at the peak, folks, people will come up with alternatives, whether it's electric cars or whether it's fracking to find our own oil and use our own oil or something like that. That's what's going to happen. So they don't go usually for, excuse me, for full profit maximization. Any questions? Let's see if this will open. Come on, baby. Well, next week, keep in mind, we're going to skip the next chapter after oligopoly and monopolistic competition. Next week, there will probably be some articles to read. There will probably be, just do this. And I'm gonna kind of hedge my bets here and say next week. I can tell you without a doubt that the homework assignment for oligopoly and monopolistic competition will be due. I can tell you that we'll have a Learn Smart for at least one chapter, but I might put 2 in there. So you'll have to watch McGraw-Hill Connect for that, okay? And then I'm anticipating right now a discussion board and some articles specifically on things like wages. I don't know if I'm going to do that for this week or next week. So I've got to take a look tomorrow, and I'll have it all posted by the end of the day tomorrow. Any questions?